Before we start, let me say something plainly, because I already know where some people's brains are going to jump the second this episode title hits their feed. This episode is not me saying America is Nazi Germany. If that's what you're waiting for, if you're already loading that response in your brain, then you're going to be very disappointed. That's not what this is. What this episode is about is why that comparison keeps coming up at all, and why every time it does, we have the same exact argument. Not about conditions, not about people, not about what's actually happening inside detention facilities, but about whether we're allowed to say a certain word. Because history doesn't just rhyme in violence, it rhymes in denial, it rhymes in euphemism, it rhymes in people arguing semantics instead of outcomes. And that argument, it shows up every single time a society builds large-scale detention systems and tells itself they're temporary, necessary, and humane. Every single time. You see, here's the pattern. Someone says, "Hey, what's happening in these facilities is flat out wrong." And another person responds, "Okay, but don't call them that." And suddenly the entire conversation stops being about human beings and becomes about vocabulary. And that's not accidental. That's the pressure valve. Because arguing about words is much safer than arguing about conditions. Words don't need food. Words don't sleep on concrete. Words don't sit under fluorescent lights wondering when they're going to see daylight again. But you know what does? People. And if you listened to History Rhymes Part 1, then you already know where I'm going with this. Part 1 was about language justifying violence, about how quickly narratives harden, about how fast the state explains itself, about how silence gets rewarded. This episode is about what happens after that, after the cameras leave, after the headlines cool off, after people stop arguing about whether force was justified. This is about detention, about what happens when the state decides certain people can be confined, warehoused, and managed outside the criminal justice system, and then insists that what you're seeing isn't what you think it is. Let me be really clear about something right at the top, because nuance definitely matters here. When people compare ICE detention facilities to concentration camps, they are not automatically saying, this is the Holocaust, this is extermination, this is genocide. That's the straw man. That's the version of the argument designed to shut the entire conversation down before it even starts. What people are actually pointing to, whether you like the term or not, are patterns. Mass detention, civil confinement without traditional due process, indefinite timelines, degrading conditions, language that sanitizes what people are experiencing. Those patterns existed long before World War II, and they have shown up in countries all over the world, including ones that thought they were immune to them. History is very clear about that. Every time those patterns show up, the defenders always say the same exact things. It's not that bad. It's only temporary. It's being blown out of proportion. They shouldn't have been here anyway. You're being unfair throwing that word around. Different century, same exact script. And that's why this episode exists. Not to shock you, and not to score any kind of points, and definitely not to collapse all of history into a lazy analogy, but to ask a much harder question. Why does the argument about the word always matter more than the people living under the conditions being described? Why does discomfort with terminology outweigh discomfort with human suffering? Why does every society that builds detention systems insist, very loudly, that this one is different. Right up until history stops asking for their opinion. We're going to talk about ICE detention facilities. We're going to talk about what people who've been inside them have said, including voices from outside the U.S. who experienced them firsthand. We're going to talk about why the term concentration camp existed way before the Nazis ever touched it, and why people pretend that history doesn't exist. And we're going to talk about why the loudest reactions usually aren't about accuracy. They're about proximity. Because once you admit that a comparison is about conditions instead of intent, you lose the comfort of saying, that could never be us. History doesn't rhyme because people are inherently evil. It rhymes because people tell themselves the same comforting stories. Stories like, this is necessary, temporary, this isn't what you think it is. Stories that always sound reasonable at the beginning. So if you're listening to this hoping for an easy villain or a clean moral bow, that's not what you're getting. What you are getting is context, pattern recognition, and a conversation that refuses to pretend this argument is anything new, because it's not. And it never ends the way people think it will. Hey, and welcome to, or welcome back to, the Average Joe Nerdcast. I'm Nate, your resident Average Joe. And before I can go any further, like I said in the last episode, these History Rhymes episodes are detours. This is not what was on the schedule. This isn't the planned content. And this definitely isn't me chasing outrage for clicks. I stopped what I was doing to make these episodes because there comes a point where sticking to the content calendar feels wrong. We're watching what's happening, hearing how it's being explained, and seeing how fast the narrative is hardening, and saying nothing stops feeling neutral. History has a pretty brutal track record when it comes to people who saw harm happening and decided it wasn't their place to speak up. And I'm not interested in being on that side of the ledger. I need to say this plainly with no hedging. I am wholly against what this administration is doing. I find the treatment of people in these immigration detention systems morally reprehensible. And at this point, this is no longer a right versus left issue to me. It's a human one. And my morality, my basic sense of humanity, would not let me stay quiet any longer. This show has always been about paying attention. And sometimes that looks like nostalgia. Sometimes it looks like video games or movies or comic books or pop culture as a whole. And sometimes it means stopping everything to talk about what's happening right here, right now. Especially when power is asking us to look away. That's what these episodes are. This is not about politics as team sports. It's not about trying to score points. And it's not about pretending we're smarter than anyone else. It's just about context, accountability, and it's about refusing to let language make cruelty feel completely normal. Because like I said in the previous episode, history does not usually collapse overnight. It erodes, explanation by explanation. So yes, I promise we will get back to the regularly scheduled nerdy stuff. All the games, the movies, all of the nostalgia. But this could not wait. Because if you believe context matters, if you believe power should be questioned, and if you believe people deserve the truth before the spin, then you don't just shrug it off and move on. So let's get into it. Okay, let's do a bit of a rehash so we can get something straight immediately. Because this phrase gets abused into meaninglessness, When people say history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, they don't mean, wow, that's interesting. They mean pay attention or you're going to miss it again. This isn't poetry, it's just pattern recognition. And right now, the pattern is fucking screaming. There's a lie we all grew up believing, that history will always announce itself, that it shows up wearing the exact same uniforms, that it uses the same words, that it makes itself obvious so good people can stop it in time. And that's bullshit. History does not come back as a sequel. It comes back as a remix. Same power dynamics, same fear, same justifications, just new branding. And if you're waiting for it to look exactly like the textbook photos, then you've already missed the point. So let me put this in the clearest possible terms. History doesn't start with camps. It doesn't start with mass graves. It doesn't start with monsters. It starts with language. It starts with this is temporary. This is for safety. This is necessary. Well, this is unfortunate, but... And that but is where everything slides. Back on track. And this is where people get defensive. Because the moment you say, hey, this feels familiar, someone will always jump in with, are you really comparing this to that? And the answer is, no. I'm comparing the process. I'm comparing the sequence. Because history doesn't test societies with obvious evil. It tests them with reasonable explanations. Here's what that sequence usually looks like. First, instability, economic anxiety, social tension, a sense that things are spinning out of control. Then, fear of the other, fear of chaos, fear of losing what little stability you still have. Then, reassurance, strong language, strong authority, strong promises that someone will handle it. Then, expanded power, more enforcement, more exceptions, more special circumstances. Then, normalization. People get used to it. The language softens. The outrage fades away. And by the time people realize something is wrong, the cost of speaking up is already higher than it used to be. That right there is the rhyme. You do not need evil people for any of this to happen. You just need ordinary people inside unquestioned systems, doing exactly what they're told and being praised for it. That's it. Most of the worst chapters in history were not written by comic book villains. They were written by professionals, by bureaucrats, by people who said, hey, I'm just doing my job. And listen, that phrase, I'm just doing my job, that's not a defense. That's a warning sign. Because systems don't require belief. They just require participation. This is why I keep coming back to language. Because violence doesn't show up naked. It shows up wearing a suit. In press releases, in official statements, in phrases like lawful, justified, necessary, and under investigation. Those words are meant to calm you down, but they are not meant to tell you the truth. By the time something looks obviously evil, it's already entrenched in the system. The real danger zone is when everything still sounds reasonable. When people are telling you to relax, when they tell you to wait, when they tell you you're being overly dramatic. That's when you're supposed to lean in and never back off. Because history doesn't punish societies for being ignorant. It punishes them for being comfortable. Comfortable with explanations, comfortable with the silence, and comfortable with letting experts handle it. And that brings us to right now. Because what we're watching unfold isn't some sudden collapse. It's that erosion. It's power explaining itself before it's questioned. It's force being justified before it's examined. It's people being labeled before they're understood. And once you understand the pattern, then you can't unsee it. So, no, I'm not trying to say we're already at the end of the story. I'm just trying to say we recognize the opening verses. And if history teaches us anything at all, it's this: the people who stop the worst outcomes are never the ones who waited for certainty. They're the ones who noticed the rhyme early and said, absolutely not. Now, to understand why this feels so familiar, then we need to go back to a place everyone thinks they already understand and talk about the part they always skip over: Germany, before the monsters. When people talk about Nazi Germany, they jump straight to the ending: the uniforms, the symbols, the camps, all the horror. And that jump is comforting because it lets us pretend the warning signs were completely obvious. But they weren't. And that's the whole point. Germany didn't suddenly wake up one morning and decide to become a cautionary tale. It was a country that felt humiliated, unstable, and exhausted. After World War I, the economy had collapsed. Savings evaporated. Inflation went so wild that money literally lost meaning. People were not debating ideology. They were just trying to eat. And when survival becomes the priority, morality often becomes negotiable. Not because people end up turning evil, but because they're desperate for something that feels solid. Most people living through the early 1930s in Germany were not extremists. They weren't cartoon villains and they weren't foaming at the mouth. They were just shop owners, factory workers, parents, veterans, clerks, people who just wanted the chaos to stop. And when chaos is loud, authority sounds like relief. The early promises didn't sound radical. They sounded completely reasonable. Restore order, stabilize the nation, crack down on threats, protect the homeland. Those phrases don't really scare people. They soothe them. Because fear wants certainty more than it wants freedom. And here's the uncomfortable truth: the early enforcement didn't feel so oppressive to most people. It just felt corrective, like someone was finally doing something about these problems. Restrictions were framed as temporary. Powers were framed as necessary. Criticism was framed as destabilizing. And people just told themselves, this is just until things calm down. They always do. Nothing about this period felt like a moral cliff. It felt like a slope. And slopes are dangerous because you don't notice how far you've slid down until turning back feels unrealistic. Every step made sense on its own. Every justification sounded reasonable in isolation. And every expansion of power came with reassurance. That's how normalization works. This is where hindsight lies to us. Because looking back, we just see the straight line. But living through it, people experienced a series of small adjustments. No single one moment screamed, hey guys, this is the turning point. Because history doesn't work like that. Nobody woke up thinking, today I'm going to participate in something completely monstrous. They woke up thinking, I just need to get through today. There's a phrase that echoes through this era, and through every authoritarian slide in history. I'm just doing my job. That sentence doesn't sound violent. It sounds responsible. It sounds professional to a degree. And that is why it's so dangerous. Because systems don't require belief. They just require your participation. So now we need to go one layer deeper. The camps did not start as death factories. They started as a solution. That's the uncomfortable truth. When most people hear concentration camp, they picture the end of the story. The barbed wire, the mass death, the industrial horror. But that's not how they were introduced. They were introduced as administrative tools. Temporary, controlled, necessary. In early 1930s Germany, the camps weren't sold as a punishment. They were just sold as containment, a place to hold people while the government figured out what to do next. Political dissidents, undesirables, people labeled as destabilizing, not criminals, problems. And at first, the goal wasn't extermination, it was deportation. Get them out of sight, get them out of society, get them somewhere else. Germany actively tried to deport the Jewish population. They didn't start with the genocide. They started with, let's make them someone else's problem. And here's where the world failed. At the Evian Conference in 1938, dozens of countries gathered to discuss the refugee crisis. Sympathy was expressed, concern was acknowledged, and almost nobody opened their doors. Everyone agreed something should be done, but no one agreed to do it. So Germany was left with a population it had already publicly labeled as dangerous, corrupting, or incompatible, and no external pressure to change course. That's when temporary solutions become permanent. And this is the key thing to really understand. The camps were sold to ordinary Germans as order, as bureaucracy, as efficiency, as public safety. They weren't framed as cruelty. They were framed as management. Think about how that sounds. These people can't be here. This is destabilizing. We don't know what else to do. This is the most humane option available. Those aren't the words of monsters. They're the words of people justifying harm while trying to feel reasonable. The camps were described as work facilities, holding centers, re-education spaces, protective custody. Language did all the heavy lifting long before violence ever escalated. And once people were physically removed, it became easier to morally remove them, out of sight, out of mind, and out of empathy. Once they were behind fences, most people didn't have to think about overcrowding, disease, abuse, or neglect, because they were no longer part of the public. This is where the rhyme gets really loud, because detention centers don't begin as atrocities. They begin as exceptions. Exceptions to due process, exceptions to comfort, exceptions to dignity. And once exceptions exist, expanding them is easy. History shows us this clearly. You don't need hatred to build camps. You just need fear or indifference and a public willing to believe suffering is unfortunate but necessary. And that's it. The most dangerous moment is not when people cheer on the cruelty. It's when they accept it quietly. When they say, I really don't like it, but what's the alternative? Because that sentence has built more camps than ideology ever has. And that's why this matters right now. Because when we hear about detention centers that are overcrowded, unsanitary, psychologically damaging, and filled with people who haven't committed violent crimes, and the only response is, well, it's complicated. History recognizes that tone almost immediately. That's the sound of a society adjusting its moral baseline. That's normalization. That's the rhyme locking in. The camps didn't horrify Germans all at once. They became background noise. And background noise is how cruelty survives. So no, this comparison isn't about saying we're already at the end of the story. It's about saying we recognize the beginning. Because history doesn't punish people for not predicting the future. It punishes them for ignoring the present. And next, we need to talk about something even more uncomfortable. And I'm not talking about Germany. I'm talking about us. When outsiders, people who are not American, who don't have our cultural blinders, look at U.S. immigration detention centers and say something along the lines of, hey, this looks uncomfortably familiar. We don't lean in. We almost recoil. And not because they're necessarily wrong, but because familiarity is terrifying. Over the last little bit, journalists, human rights observers, and foreign nationals detained in U.S. ICE facilities have used words Americans hate hearing: concentration camp, indefinite detention, collective punishment, dehumanization. And the immediate American response is almost always the same. How dare you compare us to that? Not, oh my God, is this true? Not, why does it look that way? Just, how dare you? And that reaction isn't moral outrage. It's defensiveness. Because I think deep down, people understand something very important. The comparison isn't about numbers. It's about the process. When a French national, someone raised in a country that teaches the Holocaust as a civic failure, not just a tragedy, describes being detained in an ICE facility and says, "This felt like something Europe swore to never repeat." That's not rhetoric. That's perspective. That's someone without our internal justification seeing the structure clearly. And what do they describe? Overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, constant surveillance, people held for weeks or months without clear timelines, psychological pressure, language barriers weaponized, children separated from their families, disoriented and terrified. And the most important part, people who don't know why they're there. And that last one is crucial because uncertainty is not a side effect. It's a tool. So let's talk about how this gets sold to the American public. Because the language is doing the same work it did in 1930s Germany. Listen to the words that they use. Detention center, not prison. Processing facility, not camp. Temporary holding, not indefinite confinement. Administrative backlog, not human suffering. Enforcement priority, not families. This language isn't accidental. It's anesthetic. Let me say that again. Language anesthetizes conscience. The Nazis didn't sell camps as slaughterhouses. They sold them as labor facilities, protective custody, resettlement centers, temporary solutions until deportation could be arranged. And when deportation stalled, because no one else would take them, the camps stayed. And once the camps stayed, the moral math changed completely. Now look at us. We tell ourselves, they'll be deported soon. This is just while paperwork is processed. This is necessary to discourage illegal border crossings. And when months go by, when conditions worsen, when children grow up behind fences, we don't reassess. We just normalize. And this is the part that people don't want to face. You don't need to hate immigrants to accept this system. You just need to believe they're not really like us. They chose this. This is unfortunate, yes, but it's unavoidable. And those beliefs don't come from malice. They come from repetition. One of the most dangerous phrases in modern American politics is this: well, what's the alternative? That sentence has built more camps than hatred ever has. Because it frames suffering as just inevitable, as though the only choices are cruelty or chaos. That false binary is history's favorite trick. And the truth is, if a system requires mass suffering just to function, the problem is the system itself, not the people trapped inside of it. And this is exactly where foreign observers become utterly essential, because they're not emotionally invested in defending American identity. They're just looking at the structure. And when multiple outside voices say this looks like something we were warned about, that's not an attack. That's a signal flare. Americans, we love to say, that could never happen here. But history has shown us that here is never special. What is special is how long a society can convince itself that cruelty is only temporary. Let me be very precise. Calling these facilities concentration camps is not saying, this is Auschwitz. It's saying, this is the early architecture. The same logic, the same removal, the same justifications, the same belief that because it's administrative, then it's moral. And the reason that comparison makes people furious is because it collapses the distance we rely on for comfort. It forces us to ask a question we do not want to answer. At what point does detention become disappearance? History never starts with gas chambers. It starts with fences, paperwork, guards, timelines that keep slipping, people no longer seen as neighbors, just cases. And once a group is framed as a problem to be managed instead of people to be protected, everything that follows suit can be explained away. And that, my friends, is the rhyme. So when foreign nationals speak up, when they say, guys, this feels wrong, they're not trying to insult America. They're just doing what history begs people to do. Recognize the pattern before the ending writes itself. Okay, let's talk about the flinch. Because the strongest reaction in this entire conversation isn't about policy. It's about language. Concentration camp. Say it out loud and watch what happens. People don't ask follow-up questions. They don't ask for definitions, and they don't ask for evidence. They just react. Fast, defensive, angry. How dare you? That's offensive. That's an insult to history. That cheapens the Holocaust. Let me be very clear. That reaction is not about protecting victims of history. It's just about protecting ourselves from recognition. Because if the simple comparison were obviously wrong, then it wouldn't scare anyone. It would just be laughed off. The reason it hits a nerve is because it's not about scale. It's about structure. A concentration camp is not defined by gas chambers. It's defined by mass detention without meaningful due process. People held indefinitely. Groups targeted by their identity. Removal from society. Normalized deprivation. And language designed to make it sound administrative. That definition comes from historians, from Holocaust scholars, from people who study how this starts, not how it ends. And when you put that definition next to modern immigration detention, people panic because suddenly the distance collapses. America does not object to the word because it's inaccurate. America objects to the word because it's early. It's naming something before we're comfortable naming it. We're taught one very specific version of history, that concentration camps appear at the moment of moral collapse. But let me let you in on a little secret. They don't. They appear at the moment of moral compromise. And that is where the rhyme becomes undeniable. You hear things like, they broke the law. They chose this. This is about deterrence. If we make it too comfortable, more will keep coming. It's unfortunate, but what's the alternative? Every single one of those phrases does the same exact thing. It moves suffering from a problem to a strategy. Deterrence is the key word here, because deterrence means suffering is not accidental. It's intentional. It means the harm is the point. When a system is designed so that pain discourages others from seeking safety, that system has crossed a moral line, whether people want to admit it or not. And history has a very clear name for that logic. So let me connect that directly back to Germany, because this is the part people never get taught properly. The camps were initially defended with the same reasoning. These people destabilize our society. We can't absorb them. We don't know where else to put them. This is just temporary until we can deport them. And this is the most humane option available. Sound familiar? The camps weren't sold as punishment. They were just sold as management, as a regrettable necessity, as something unfortunate that serious adults understood. But here's the part that should make your stomach drop. Most Germans didn't cheer the camps. They just accepted them. They looked away. They trusted that someone else had thought it through. And that's the part Americans don't want to recognize. Because acceptance feels passive. It feels innocent. But history does not distinguish between cruelty and tolerated cruelty. So when people say, well, they shouldn't have come here illegally, what they're really saying is, this suffering doesn't count the same. When people say, this isn't the same thing, what they're really saying is, please don't make me examine the structure. But here's the truth that makes people angry. You don't need death camps for the comparison to be morally relevant. You need normalized dehumanization. You need a group reduced to numbers, cases, backlogs, threats, and deterrence. And once that happens, then the rest just becomes logistics. And this is why Americans fight the comparison so hard. Because accepting it doesn't mean admitting we're evil. It just means admitting we are capable. Capable of explaining away cruelty, of tolerating suffering, and capable of repeating patterns we swear that we learned from. History, you see, doesn't condemn societies for their worst moments. It condemns them for the moments they justify. So when people say, don't use that word, what they're really saying is, don't force me to see where this could lead. And history's answer to that plea has always been the exact same. You don't get to choose when recognition becomes uncomfortable. Because once you build a system that requires human misery to function, then you don't get to argue semantics. You get to answer for the outcomes. And this part is where it's going to get a little uncomfortable. Because once you understand the pattern, once you recognize the rhyme, the question stops being, is this happening? And becomes, what am I doing about it? So let me be clear about something. History does not judge societies by what leaders did alone. It judges them by what everyone else tolerated. You see, that's the part we try to edit out. We love stories where evil has a face, a dictator, a clear villain, a bad guy you can point at and say, that's where it went wrong. But that's not how history actually works. History is built by systems, not monsters. And systems only function when enough people decide, this isn't my problem. Responsibility doesn't mean guilt. It just means proximity. It means awareness. It means knowing something is wrong and deciding whether that knowledge changes your behavior or just makes you uncomfortable for a minute before you scroll right past it. And this is where Americans can get defensive, because nobody wants to believe they'd be that person. The person who stayed quiet. The person who just looked away. The person who said, well, I don't love it, but... And history is full of those people. And they weren't evil. They were busy. They were tired. They were scared. They were convinced that someone else would fix it. But here's the hard truth. Silence does not mean you approve, but it does mean you're allowing it to continue. And history, well, history does not distinguish between those two outcomes. So when people say, I'm not really political, what they often mean is, I don't want to feel responsible for this shit. But power loves apathy because apathy is stable. You don't have to hate immigrants to accept their suffering. You just have to believe it's distant. You just have to believe it's complicated. You just have to believe it doesn't touch your life. And that belief has paved more roads to camps than ideology ever has. There's something history makes brutally clear. The people who stop the worst outcomes are never the majority at first. They're the ones who noticed early on, the ones who spoke when it was awkward, the ones who refused to wait for permission. And no, this isn't about purity. It's not about having the perfect take. It's just about refusing the lie that staying quiet keeps you clean. Because it doesn't. It just keeps you uninvolved. And we all wind up dirty in the end. You know, there's a sentence people love to say when conversations like this get heavy. What do you want me to do about it? And I get that impulse. But here's the thing. History doesn't really ask for heroics. It just asks for refusal. Refusal to normalize cruelty. Refusal to let language erase people. Refusal to accept suffering as policy. And responsibility looks like not letting euphemisms slide. Not dismissing testimony because it's inconvenient. Not waiting for permission to care. Not letting temporary become permanent without protest. You do not need certainty to act responsibly. You just need pattern recognition. History is not a courtroom. It doesn't require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It asks whether you noticed the warning signs and whether you chose comfort anyways. This is why history will judge us, is not a threat. It's a reminder. Because history is not written by time. It's written by memory, by records, by testimony, by who spoke and who stayed quiet. So when future generations look back at this moment, they won't ask, did everyone agree? They'll just ask, who said something before it was safe? And this is where I land personally. No hedging, no neutrality. I refuse to be quiet about systems that require human suffering to function. I refuse to let language turn people into problems. And I refuse the idea that staying silent makes me reasonable. Because history rarely looks kindly on those who remained quiet. Because they knew. And they chose comfort anyways. And if this episode does nothing else, I hope it makes one thing impossible to unsee. The rhyme does not finish itself. It finishes when enough people decide not to interrupt it. And that's the hurt. And that's also the responsibility. Before we get out of here, let's run through a few checkpoints that are happening right now. One of the quietest moves happening right now is capacity expansion being sold as relief. You'll hear it framed as reducing overcrowding, improving conditions, addressing a backlog. And that all sounds humane, right? But here's the trick history knows all too well. When you build more space for detention, you don't fix the system. You lock it in. Temporary infrastructure becomes permanent architecture. Emergency funding becomes baseline policy. And suddenly the question isn't why do we have camps? It's how do we manage them better? And that's not reform. That's normalization with better lighting. Here's another move that should raise alarms. More and more detention operations, food, medical care, transport, even facility management are being handed off to private contractors. And the moment that happens, accountability gets a little fuzzy. Abuse isn't state violence anymore, it's a vendor issue, a subcontractor problem, a compliance review, and history loves this move. Because when responsibility gets fragmented, justice slows way down, and suffering becomes a line item instead of a moral failure. The system, it keeps on running, just with fewer fingerprints. Now, this next one's much darker, but it needs to be said plainly. Pay attention to how often officials talk about deterrence outcomes. Not safety, not resolution, not due process. Deterrence. That word means the harm is not accidental. It means suffering is being used on purpose to send a message. History has a very clear opinion about systems that rely on pain just to function. And they don't drift there by accident. They decide it's acceptable and then argue about how much is reasonable. And that's not enforcement, that's strategy. Another quiet shift worth watching: access. Journalists, lawyers, NGOs, independent observers. Whenever you hear restrictions justified by security or operational integrity, understand what's really being said. Visibility is inconvenient, and history teaches us something very consistent. Abuse thrives where observation thins out. You don't restrict access when things are going well. You restrict access when scrutiny is the problem. And that's not stability, that's insulation. Okay, last one. But this is how it always spreads. Pay attention to who now qualifies for detention. Minor paperwork issues, expanded risk assessments, looser definitions of threat, broader enforcement discretion. This is called category creep. The system doesn't change its purpose, it just changes its reach. And once the net widens quietly, pulling it back becomes politically impossible. History doesn't explode outward, it expands sideways. And none of these things alone are the ending. And that's the trap. They're all beginnings, all justifiable, all explainable, and all reasonable. And taken together, they're the architecture. So let's land this plane the right way. History doesn't ask whether you were loud, doesn't ask whether you were perfect, and it definitely doesn't ask whether you waited until it was safe. History asks something much simpler, but harder. Did you recognize the pattern when it was still interruptible? Every era of history tells itself a story about why this time is different. Better intentions, better oversight, better language. But history doesn't measure intentions. It measures the outcomes. And when outcomes require people to suffer quietly so the system can function smoothly, then the moral math has already failed. What we're talking about today isn't a prediction. It's just a diagnosis. It's noticing the same early architecture. People turned into categories. Suffering reframed as deterrence. Confinement sold as administration. Visibility treated as a liability. Those aren't endpoints. They're on-ramps. And the reason this conversation makes people so uneasy isn't because it's extreme. It's because it's early. It's early enough that saying something still matters. And it's early enough that choices haven't calcified into inevitability. History doesn't reward societies for realizing they were wrong eventually. It remembers who interrupted the process before the damage was irreversible. So if you're waiting for certainty, then you're never going to get it. History doesn't hand out guarantees. It hands out opportunities to refuse normalization. And that is the ask here. Not panic, not purity, not performative outrage. Just refusal. Refusal to let language anesthetize conscience. Refusal to accept suffering as strategy. And refusal to look away because the victims have been labeled the other. The rhyme, it doesn't finish itself. It finishes when enough people decide not to interrupt it. So if you made it to the end of this episode, thank you. Truly. This wasn't a comfortable research and writing and recording session, but it wasn't meant to be. And the fact that you stayed says something about You. If this episode stuck with you, then use it to keep people human. Share it with someone who still believes that context absolutely matters, and someone who hasn't made up their mind just yet. If you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your shows, follow the pod and leave a rating if you feel so inclined. Just know that it helps more than you'd think, and it tells the algorithm that this show isn't just noise. And if you want a place where these conversations don't turn into shouting matches, then come hang out with us in the Average Joe Nerdcast private Facebook group. That's where we have real conversations, play stupid games, and we have a lot of fun. I'll post the link in the show notes, or just go ahead and hop over to Facebook and in the search bar, just type Average Joe Nerdcast, the lobby, and you will find the page. The lobby's always open. As always, shout out to my player 2 for keeping me grounded when these conversations get too damn heavy in my brain. And shout out to everyone behind the scenes. And shout out to each and every one of you for hanging out with me and for paying attention when it would be so much easier to just not. Until next time, stay present, stay human, stay gold, nerd bold, and don't look away. I'll catch you on the next one.
Game over.